It was supposed to herald a new era of Soviet tank warfare. Rather brashly nicknamed the land battleship, the T-35 was without question a mighty beast of a machine, but it was also one that was loathed by its own soldiers. This is what happens when ego and prestige take precedence over practicalities, and a perfect example of how quickly times can change. The T-35, originally designed with more First World War-like combat in mind, proved hopelessly out of place against the more nimble German tanks. It was a tank that the Soviet High Command had high hopes for, but its shocking performance during Operation Barbarossa quickly put paid to any of those illusions. This hulking tank remains a perfect example of how bigger is not always better. But this is also a story that came with a rather peculiar ending for one particular tank. As Soviet forces stormed towards Berlin in 1945, what did they find staring back at them but one of their own T-35 tanks now blocking their path? It was somewhat of a bizarre ending for this lumbering oaf of a tank, but one that seems appropriate considering its rather rocky and chaotic journey, which of course we're going to get into today, so let's do it. The Soviets deployed some excellent tanks during World War II, and also some ones that pretty much sucked. By the end of the 1930s and on the eve of war, the Soviet Union had the widest variety of tanks of any nation, while also having the largest number overall. A good start. When the T-34 first appeared in 1940, it was widely considered the most modern and perhaps the best tank in the world. The medium tank came with a 76.2mm tank gun, which at the time was more powerful than anything else on the battlefield. The T-34 was also fast, reliable, and packed a hell of a punch. In short, it was an excellent tank, and much of the focus fell on this workhorse that would play a huge role in the defense of the Soviet Union and the blistering surge west that finally defeated Nazi Germany. So many moons ago, we made a video about the Soviet 5-year plan in which the country attempted one of its most radical grand acts of industrialization ever seen, and I know that you've probably not seen that video because it did terribly. It only partially worked, and millions died through famine as a result, but one thing they certainly managed to do was increase industrial output, whether that be with the production of tractors and trucks or tanks, and it really is a fascinating video, so I mean, don't stop watching this one, because you guys just love videos about giant war machines, but if you'd like a kind of grander scale project, it's a really good video. I really enjoyed making it. At the start of the war, they had roughly 20,000 tanks at their disposal, and by the end, their number was over 60,000. In terms of a relentless tank-producing machine, the Soviet factories were absolutely second to none. But, as with many countries, the tanks that had been produced through the 1930s were often very different from what was left at the end of the war. The war itself was a steep learning curve, as nations quickly discovered that what had succeeded in World War I wouldn't necessarily work in World War II. For two wars that weren't that far apart and have really similar names, they were really different. In this aspect, the Soviets were slightly ahead, or at least on par with the Germans. Both nations had sent tanks to fight in the Spanish Civil War, fought between 1936 and 1939, and had gained a much better understanding of how tanks would operate in more modern warfare. It became clear that tank-to-tank and tank-to-towed anti-tank gun engagements would be much more prevalent in the future. So with that in mind, it was generally believed that modern tanks would need to be heavily armored with some seriously heavyweight guns on board. The development of the T-35 began back in 1930 at the Okmo Design Bureau of the Bolshevik factory in St. Petersburg. Not only were the Soviets looking for a truly heavy tank, but also one that came with multiple turrets. The single turret design that had been common in World War I was now falling out of fashion, and the British, French, and Germans were all actively exploring multi-turret options. The addition of more turrets more often than not led to more guns, and the T-35 would be the only 5-turret tank to enter production, and probably where it got its nickname, the land battleship. So, two separate designs of heavy tank were developed concurrently, with the super heavy 100-ton TG5 tank not getting past the design stage. The first prototype of what would eventually be the T-35 appeared in July 1932 as a 35-ton tank with a 76.2mm tank gun, but it experienced such severe problems that the project was essentially sent all the way back to the drawing board. The design bore more than a little resemblance to the British Vickers A1E1 independent prototype, a massive tank that was developed between the wars but never saw combat, though the Soviets always vehemently denied that they had taken inspiration from the British design. but they kinda probably did. A new prototype was accepted for production on August 11th, 1933, and 2 batches of 10 tanks were ordered. This new version came with a new engine, new gearbox, and an improved transmission, which appeared to improve reliability. In 1935, production was widened, with a further 35 being built up until 1938. These versions, referred to as the T-35 model 1935, were slightly different, with a longer chassis, an improved hull, and 2 auxiliary 45mm guns instead of the smaller 37mm from the previous model. Something to mention about the T-35 was the variability between individual tanks. Some had flamethrowers installed instead of their main gun, which until now was something I just thought was in video games. And it was also common to see minor upgrades along the way. With that in mind, it was somewhat rare to find 2 identical T-35s. The final group of tanks were the 6 T-35 model 1938s, which came with conical turrets and a maximum thickness of 25mm, while the general armored plates on the front increased to 70mm. The tank's weight had also ballooned from 42.4 tons on the earliest models to 54 tons for the final series, which is roughly around the same as 100 horses, because here on mega projects we love weird units of measurement. In total, only 61 T-35 tanks rolled off the production line. It was as if there wasn't a great deal of confidence in this giant beast of a tank from the very beginning. As I just mentioned, many of the individual tanks came with unique characteristics, but overall, most would have seemed roughly the same to the untrained observer. The T-35 was a truly massive tank and stood at 9.72 meters in length, 3.2 meters in width, and 3.43 meters in height. That is massive. At 31 square meters, it had an area equal to that of just under 8 king-size beds. It came with an M17L aero engine with an output of 580 horsepower. That's about 4 modern Mini Coopers, just in case you're interested, and it had a top speed of around 30 kilometers per hour, but just 14 kilometers per hour off-road. That seems to be quite underpowered, because a Mini Cooper is approximately this big, and this tank seems to be about the size of a house. The hull itself was formed of various armored plates, which differed in thickness across the tank. As I said, the front of the tank came with the largest at 70mm, while the sides had 20mm thick plates, the roof 10mm, and the glacis, the sloped front section, and nose came with 30mm plates. The running gear consisted of 4 external suspension components, which carried a separate wheel set attached to the vehicle. Each had 4 coiled spring suspension arms in 2 pairs, with 2 pairs of road wheels in between them. At the rear of the tank was a drive sprocket, along with 6 return rollers, small rollers placed at the top of the track loop to keep it straight and taut. The tank's track was made up of 135 separate links, each 526mm wide. The tank came with a dizzying array of firepower. There was the main gun, usually a 76.2mm, 2 auxiliary guns, both 45mm, and 5 machine guns, each 7.62mm, just for good measure. It also came with quite a collection of men who were needed to run it, 10 in total, and 12 if you count the 2 dismounted engineering personnel. Before we move on to the nitty-gritty, it's worth just setting the scene a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, the Soviets had amassed a gigantic number of tanks by the outbreak of war. Some say more than every other nation put together. Numbers were certainly not the problem here, both in terms of actual tanks and their crews. No, the problem the Soviets faced as Hitler's intentions to invade the Soviet Union became clear were much more deep-rooted. The military purges of the 1930s had decimated officer numbers across all aspects of the army. Though others had been drafted in, many lacked the knowledge, fortitude, and experience to take on the well-trained German army. What a surprise! When you kill all your officers and replace them with new people, the army is not very good. Shocking. Another serious problem that the Soviet tank divisions would soon experience was the occasionally chaotic, occasionally non-existent, and rarely suitable maintenance systems on offer. The Soviets were relying on pure numbers to overwhelm their enemy, but the support that those complex machines required was far from adequate. The first recorded instance of the T-35s entering combat came during the Battle of Brody between the 23rd and the 30th of June 1941 as Operation Barbarossa got underway. At the time, it was one of the largest tank battles that had ever taken place, though it would be dwarfed by the Battle of Kursk just over 2 years later. For the Soviets, the Battle of Brody was a painful introduction to a war that would push the country to the very edge. 3,500 Soviet tanks took part in the battle against just 750 German tanks. In terms of numerical superiority, the result should have been very different. After nearly a week of fighting, the Soviets had lost over 800 tanks, many of which were the light T-26 or BT-7 tanks, which were no match for the German panzers. The T-35s had also fared poorly. Many had broken down and had simply been abandoned by their crews. Most nations used trucks or tractors to drag damaged tanks out of the battle and back to where they could be repaired. But the T-35's enormous weight usually meant that 2 vehicles were needed. It meant that many of these costly machines were simply left to rot on the battlefield. Others had been little more than sitting ducks for the maneuverable German tanks. The T-35 may have come with plenty of firepower, but its lack of mobility in combat and level of armor hampered it every step of the way. Official Soviet records state that only 4 T-35s were lost in the battle, although if we have learned anything, it's that Soviet statistics should be taken with healthy pinch of salt, shall we say. As the Germans bullied their way mercilessly across the Soviet Union, there was little Soviet forces could do to hold them up. At the start of Operation Barbarossa, we believe that only 58 T-35s remained in existence, of which only 48 were combat ready. As we mentioned, maintenance issues. They certainly played their part in the defense of the homeland, albeit a slightly shambolic part. In the majority of cases, the reasons the T-35s were abandoned wasn't down to enemy action, but rather just their hopeless reliability. Transmission issues seemed to be the most common cause of problems, but this was definitely worsened by the pitiful field repair on offer, which often saw the tanks used well past their recommended normal service intervals. Even when they could haul a bedraggled tank back to a vehicle workshop, there were almost no spare parts available. The final bit of action the T-35s ever officially saw came during the First Battle of Kharkov, which began on the 20th of October 1941. Kharkov, now located in present-day Ukraine, was an important industrial city, and as the Germans closed in, Soviet commanders ordered a last-ditch defense of the city, while its factories were dismantled and shipped further east. As it happened, 4 T-35 tanks were undergoing repairs in a factory in the city at the time. They were hurriedly re-equipped and sent out into the action. By this point, most of the manufacturing sector had already been evacuated, with 320 trains departing Kharkov with the equipment from 70 major factories, which was just in time because the German 6th Army took the city on the 24th of October 1941. But this was the last time the Soviets would ever use a T-35. Now, during the First Battle of Kharkov, the Germans captured a T-35 that was in remarkably good condition. The sheer size of this colossus was no doubt of great interest, and the tank with the serial number 71562 was immediately shipped back to Germany. At the time, the Germans were developing their own monstrous tanks, and, well, if you're interested, you can check out our video on the Maus Panzer tank. The massive T-35 was carefully inspected and taken apart, and interestingly, they found a wildly different armored thickness, even in places where it should have been the same, probably down to the poor quality of the steel. Once the Germans felt they had learned all they could, the tank was stripped of its armaments and installed in the museum at Kummersdorf, no doubt to exemplify the glorious power of the German army in defeating such a behemoth. But, oh, how things change. Fast forward 2 years, and the German Wehrmacht was collapsing on both fronts, with the Allies pushing from the west and the Soviets, eager for some payback, rampaging through German-held territory to the east. In April 1945, with the end now in sight, Soviet forces pushed on towards the town of Zossen, just south of Berlin. In an act of pure desperation, the Germans dragged the now immobile T-35 from the Kummersdorf Museum and used it as a fortification and a barricade in the way of the advancing Soviet troops. It's not immediately clear if some kind of armament was reinstalled in the tank or if it was simply used as a large hulking obstacle, but either way, it did really do any good. On the 22nd of April, Zossen was overrun, and this T-35, which had probably been present during the earliest moments of the war on the Eastern Front, was also there to see the final weeks of the conflict as the Soviets entered Berlin. It's difficult to look at the T-35 as much else than a glorious failure, a tank that was both well out of touch with the times and deeply flawed. The idea of stacking so many turrets and guns on one tank had spectacularly backfired, and it was an experiment that was never repeated. Ironically, the Germans using it as a glorified roadblock may have actually been the best use of the T-35. But let's give it to the Soviet designers. When the idea was first mooted in the early 1930s, the idea of a vast moving battleship with a huge amount of firepower certainly sounded like a reasonable idea. However, the speed of change and the methods of warfare quickly overwhelmed the T-35. Add on the rather disorganized servicing system the Soviets had in place at the start of the war, and well, you've just got a bit of a recipe for disaster, don't you? This wasn't so much a land battleship, but rather Jabba the Hutt with plenty of guns. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Also, if you'd like more from me, why not check out the side project sister channel to this channel, which I will link to below, and thank you for watching.